in the restless spring of 1865. With the Civil War grinding toward a brutal finish, and the 13th Amendment formally ending slavery across the United States, a 7-year-old black girl in rural Georgia started showing abilities that would upend every belief white society clung to regarding black intelligence, human memory, and the limits of a child's mind. Her name was Sarah Brown, and she possessed what modern psychology would call eidetic, or photographic memory, the power to recall images, texts, sounds, and experiences with flawless accuracy after just one brief exposure. It was as though her mind could snap pictures of everything she encountered and store them permanently, ready for retrieval with complete precision. Sarah was born in 1858 on a plantation in Wilkes County, Georgia, to parents who had been enslaved since birth. Her mother, Harriet Brown, worked as a house servant in the plantation's main house, a role seen as relatively privileged compared to fieldwork, but one that carried its own forms of exploitation and danger, especially for enslaved women vulnerable to sexual violence from white men who held absolute power over their bodies. Her father, whose name never appeared in any surviving records, was thought to have been one of the field workers on the same plantation, though some whispered he might have been a white overseer, a common reality in a system where enslaved women had no means to refuse the advances of men with power over their lives. Sarah's early years unfolded during the brutal final stretch of slavery, a period when the institution faced growing pressure from the war. Yet its daily violence and dehumanization continued without pause for those still in bondage. The plantation she lived on was smaller than the massive cotton operations further south, focusing mainly on food crops and livestock to supply Confederate armies. But conditions were harsh and discipline was severe, as owners and overseers fought to keep control over an enslaved population that sensed freedom might be near and showed growing resistance to the regime that held them. Before we go further with this powerful story, if you believe the memory of our people must never be erased, drop a comment saying where you're watching from and subscribe so our community can grow and our voice can grow stronger. Now, let's return to Sarah Brown, the girl with the photographic memory. When Union forces swept through Georgia in late 1864 and early 1865 during Sherman's march to the sea and then northward through the Carolinas, the social order of slavery started to crumble even before legal emancipation. Enslaved people fled plantations as Union troops came near, sought protection with Northern armies, or simply stopped working and began acting as free people before the law recognized their freedom. The plantation where Sarah lived experienced this collapse. Many enslaved workers fled. The white family temporarily abandoned the property, and the remaining black people were left in a state of uncertain freedom, no longer enslaved in practice, but not yet legally free, with no resources or infrastructure to support them. When emancipation officially came in 1865, Sarah was 7 years old enough to have clear memories of slavery, to have experienced its trauma and witnessed its violence, yet young enough that her development and education would be shaped mainly by the new, deeply imperfect reality of freedom. Harriet and Sarah stayed in Wilkes County, like many newly freed people with nowhere else to go and no means to migrate to regions where opportunities might be better. They moved to Washington, Georgia, the county seat, where a settlement of freed black people had quickly formed as former slaves gathered for mutual support, protection, and the hope of building new lives. Life in Washington in 1865 and 1866 was precarious and difficult for freed black people. Employment was scarce and poorly paid when it could be found at all. White residents were hostile to black freedom and black presence in the town, using violence and intimidation to push black people out or force them back into labor arrangements that resembled slavery in everything but name. The Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency tasked with helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, had minimal presence in the area and few resources to assist the thousands desperately needing food, shelter, employment, education, and protection from violence. Harriet found work as a laundress and domestic servant for white families, earning barely enough to keep herself and her daughter alive in a one-room cabin in the black settlement. She worked long hours, often from before dawn until after dark, doing the back-breaking labor of hand-washing clothes, carrying heavy loads of wet laundry, and heating water over open fires in any season or weather. It was brutal work that destroyed her health, leaving her exhausted and aged beyond her years. But she endured it because she was determined that Sarah would have opportunities slavery had denied. Opportunities that would give her daughter a life different from and better than the one Harriet had known. The most important opportunity, the one that represented hope, dignity, and future possibility for freed black people, was education. During slavery, it had been illegal in most southern states to teach enslaved people to read and write. Literacy was understood by both the enslaved and enslavers as dangerous, a form of power that threatened the control slavery depended on. Enslaved people who could read might access abolitionist literature, forge passes to escape, or communicate in ways overseers couldn't monitor. So literacy was criminalized and violently suppressed, with enslaved people caught learning to read facing brutal punishments, whippings, mutilation, sale away from family, and anyone caught teaching them facing legal penalties and social ostracism. But with emancipation came an explosion of hunger for education among freed people. Adults who had been denied literacy their whole lives sought to learn. Parents were desperate to ensure their children had the education they had been denied. Learning to read and write was seen not just as a practical skill, but as claiming humanity, exercising freedom, and accessing power that had been violently withheld. Black communities organized schools, despite having almost no resources, meeting in churches, homes, and any available space, teaching with whatever materials could be scavenged or donated, learning by candlelight and firelight when work prevented daytime attendance. In Washington, education for black children was dangerous and nearly impossible to access right after emancipation. White society violently opposed black literacy, viewing educated black people as threats to the racial hierarchy, meant to replace slavery as the organizing principle of Southern society. Schools for black children were burned. Teachers were threatened and sometimes killed, and students were harassed and attacked. But despite these dangers, black communities and northern missionaries persisted in creating educational opportunities, driven by the understanding that education was essential to freedom and to the possibility of building better futures. Harriet enrolled Sarah in one of these makeshift schools in late 1865, a few months after emancipation. The school was held in a small wooden church the black community had built quickly after freedom came, using scavenged materials and donated labor, creating a structure that served as a place of worship on Sundays and a schoolhouse on weekday evenings. The teacher was a young black woman named Martha Williams, born free in the North and educated by Quaker missionaries committed to black education. Martha had come south after the war as part of the wave of idealistic Northern teachers who believed education could help freed people claim full citizenship and build a more just society in the South. Classes were held by candlelight and firelight after sunset, when students who worked during the day could attend. Most of Martha's students were adults and older children who had never been allowed to learn during slavery, and were now learning basic literacy slowly and with great difficulty. But she also had younger children like Sarah, who were beginning their education without the burden of years spent being told they couldn't learn. Approaching literacy with the natural enthusiasm and quick learning children bring to new skills. It was in Martha Williams's classroom in the winter of 1865-1866 that Sarah's extraordinary memory first became obvious and undeniable to observers beyond her own family. Martha was teaching basic literacy, the alphabet, simple words, the connections between letters and sounds that are the foundation of reading. She used slates and chalk when she could get them, wrote letters and words on scraps of paper for students to practice copying, and read aloud from the few books available, primarily Bibles and spelling primers donated by Northern charitable organizations. Most of her students learned slowly and with difficulty, as anyone would when starting from complete illiteracy, attending school only sporadically due to work obligations, learning by inadequate light with inadequate materials, and exhausted from long days of labor. Adults who had spent their entire lives being told they couldn't learn often struggled with the basics, not because they lacked intelligence, but because learning is harder when you're older and decades of being denied education have convinced you that you're incapable of intellectual achievement. But Sarah was different in ways Martha had never encountered in her several years of teaching. After a single lesson on the alphabet, Sarah could recite all 26 letters forward and backward without error, identify each letter by sight, and write each letter from memory. After one reading of a simple Bible passage, Sarah could recite it word for word, maintaining the exact wording, punctuation, and even the rhythm and cadence Martha had used when reading aloud. When Martha wrote words on the slate board and erased them, Sarah could tell her exactly what had been written and where each word had been positioned on the board, as if she were still looking at the slate, even though it had been erased. It was as if Sarah's mind was capturing everything she saw and heard with perfect fidelity, and storing it permanently for instant and complete recall. Martha initially thought Sarah must have been secretly educated before coming to school, despite the legal prohibitions on teaching enslaved people to read. Perhaps Harriet had been literate and taught her daughter in secret, or someone else on the plantation had taken the risk. But when Martha asked Harriet, the response was unequivocal. Sarah had never been taught anything before coming to school. Harriet herself was completely illiterate, had never been allowed to learn during slavery, and had no way to teach her daughter, even if she had wanted to risk the brutal punishments that would have followed if caught. Sarah's abilities were as surprising and mysterious to her mother as they were to her teacher. To test whether Sarah's abilities were as extraordinary as they appeared, Martha began showing her increasingly complex materials. Longer Bible passages, pages from geography books and histories, mathematical tables, anything she could find among the limited materials available. Sarah could reproduce all of it from memory after a single brief viewing. When shown a page of text for just a few seconds, she could recite the entire page word for word, maintaining line breaks and paragraph structure, as if reading from the page, even though it was no longer in front of her, and she had seen it only briefly. When shown a map, even a complex one showing multiple countries or states with rivers, mountains, and cities marked, she could draw it from memory with remarkable accuracy, reproducing shapes, relative positions, and small details like decorative borders, compass roses, and specific fonts used for labels. When shown a drawing or illustration from a book, she could reproduce it with impressive fidelity, capturing not just the main elements, but small details of shading, proportion, and perspective most people wouldn't consciously notice or remember. When Martha read her lists of random information, strings of numbers, series of unrelated words, sequences of dates and names, Sarah could repeat them back perfectly, recall them hours or days later, and recite them forward, backward, or starting from any point in the sequence. Martha Williams was both amazed and troubled by what she witnessed. Sarah's abilities were extraordinary and clearly represented intellectual capacity, exceptional by any standard. This was evidence that directly contradicted every racist theory about black intellectual inferiority that white society used to justify slavery and continued oppression. If a 7-year-old black girl with no formal education and no access to books or resources could demonstrate memory abilities exceeding what university-educated white adults could achieve, then the entire edifice of scientific racism and claims about natural racial hierarchies was exposed as the lie it had always been. But Martha also understood that Sarah's gifts would make her a target in the violent and unstable context of Reconstruction-era Georgia. Exceptional abilities in a black child would draw attention, create interest among whites who might want to study or exploit her, or who might feel threatened by evidence of black genius challenging their worldview. In a time and place where black success and excellence were seen as threats to white supremacy, Sarah's perfect memory could bring danger rather than opportunity. Martha consulted with other members of the black community, ministers, teachers, and elders who had experience navigating the dangers of being black in the South, who understood the delicate calculations required to survive in a society nominally free but structured to maintain white domination through violence and intimidation. The consensus was clear and unanimous: Sarah's abilities should be kept as quiet as possible. She should be taught, encouraged, and given every opportunity to develop her gifts, but she should not be displayed publicly or talked about outside the black community. The community needed to protect her from the attention that might otherwise destroy her. This protective secrecy lasted only a few months before circumstances forced Sarah's gifts into public visibility in ways that would change her life permanently and create one of the most disturbing and least known cases of exploitation and suppressed genius in Reconstruction history. In the spring of 1866, a white physician named Dr. Charles Morrison came to Washington, Georgia, as part of a Freedmen's Bureau mission to assess the health and living conditions of newly freed black people in the region. Dr. Morrison was from Pennsylvania, had served as a Union Army surgeon during the war, and considered himself sympathetic to black people and supportive of their advancement. Though his sympathy was paternalistic and condescending, mixed with scientific racism and assumptions about black inferiority, nearly universal among white people of his era, even those who opposed slavery and supported emancipation. Dr. Morrison's work with the Freedmen's Bureau involved conducting basic medical examinations of freed people, documenting living conditions and health problems, and writing reports to help the Bureau determine what resources and assistance were needed in different areas. As part of this work, he visited the black settlement in Washington where Sarah and Harriet lived, examining people with various ailments, injuries, and chronic conditions resulting from years of slavery's brutal treatment of black bodies. During his visit, Dr. Morrison happened to observe one of Martha Williams's evening classes in the church. Curious about the educational efforts Northern missionaries and black communities were making and wanting to see for himself how freed people were responding to educational opportunities, he witnessed Sarah demonstrating her memory abilities, reciting long Bible passages after single readings, reproducing maps and diagrams from memory, answering questions about materials she had seen only briefly. Dr. Morrison was stunned by what he observed and immediately recognized he was witnessing something extraordinary that warranted further investigation and documentation from a medical and scientific perspective. He approached Harriet Brown and asked permission to examine Sarah more thoroughly, to conduct systematic tests of her memory abilities, and to document what appeared to be an unprecedented case of eidetic memory in a child. Harriet was deeply reluctant. She understood intuitively that allowing white authorities to study her daughter was dangerous, that Sarah might become a spectacle, be taken away from her, or be exploited in ways Harriet couldn't prevent or control. She had lived her entire life understanding that white interest in black people was never benign, that white attention brought danger, and that anything making a black person exceptional or valuable in white eyes could lead to exploitation or worse. But Dr. Morrison was persuasive, and he had authority as a Freedmen's Bureau representative. He assured Harriet that Sarah would be treated respectfully, that the examination would be brief and conducted locally rather than requiring Sarah to travel, that the knowledge gained would benefit not just science, but also provide evidence of black intellectual capacity that could help the cause of racial equality and black advancement. He promised Sarah wouldn't be harmed, that Harriet could be present during all examinations, and that no one would take Sarah away from her mother. He framed his interest as benevolent and scientific rather than exploitative. In the context of 1866, when the Freedmen's Bureau represented federal authority and refusing white requests was dangerous for black people regardless of what rights emancipation was supposed to have granted, Harriet felt she had little choice but to agree. Over the following weeks in spring 1866, Dr. Morrison conducted extensive testing of Sarah's memory abilities, using whatever materials he could find or create. He would show her pages from medical textbooks, the only books he had access to, and ask her to recite them. He would draw complex anatomical diagrams and ask her to reproduce them hours or days later. He would read her lists of random words, numbers, or dates and test her recall after various delays. He would show her photographs and illustrations, and then ask her to describe them in detail or draw what she had seen. Sarah's performance was consistent and remarkable across all these tests. She could recall text with perfect accuracy, reproducing not just the content and meaning, but the exact wording, punctuation, capitalization, and even typographical errors or unusual formatting. She could reproduce images with impressive fidelity, capturing details of shading, proportion, perspective, and composition that most people wouldn't consciously notice. She could remember lists of random information, strings of numbers, series of unrelated words, sequences of nonsense syllables, with perfect accuracy even after delays of hours or days. Her recall seemed truly photographic, as if she were reading from or looking at internal images of material she had seen previously, rather than reconstructing memories from abstracted or processed information the way most people do. Dr. Morrison was meticulous in his testing and documentation, conducting experiments to rule out alternative explanations for Sarah's abilities. He tested whether she might be using memory techniques or tricks rather than genuinely having eidetic recall. He tested whether her abilities were specific to certain types of material or extended across all forms of information. He tested whether her recall degraded over time or remained perfect indefinitely. In every case, the results confirmed that Sarah possessed genuine eidetic memory of a kind extremely rare and exceeding anything Dr. Morrison had encountered in his medical career or read about in medical literature. He documented his findings in detailed reports sent to medical journals in Philadelphia and Boston, describing Sarah as a Negro child of approximately traits memory abilities that exceed anything previously documented in medical or psychological literature. He noted that to be truly eidetic or photographic in nature, suggesting her mind captures and stores exact information with a perfect mentality rather than processing it as the men are typically not healing it. Memories with rough and the metal of human money. Money goes as yours, you'll live in PC, and the story came into about red. He speculated about possible neurological mechanisms that might account for her abilities, though with the primitive understanding of brain function in 1866, his theories were necessarily vague and largely wrong. But Dr. Morrison's scientific interest quickly transformed into something more troubling and exploitative. He recognized that Sarah's case could bring him professional recognition and prestige. Medical journals would publish articles about such an extraordinary case. Universities might invite him to present his findings. His name would be associated with the discovery and documentation of unprecedented human abilities, advancing his career significantly beyond the relatively modest achievements of being a Union Army surgeon and Freedmen's Bureau doctor. He also recognized that Sarah could be profitable in more direct ways. White audiences would pay to see the Negro child with perfect memory. Demonstrations of her abilities could generate income. Dr. Morrison could keep for himself while paying Harriet only token amounts or nothing at all. In a time and place where black people had minimal legal rights, and their labor and even bodies could be exploited with impunity, Sarah represented an opportunity for profit. Dr. Morrison decided to pursue despite ethical problems that should have been obvious even by the standards of 1866. Beginning in summer 1866, Dr. Morrison began organizing public demonstrations of Sarah's abilities. He placed advertisements in local newspapers and in newspapers in nearby towns, Athens, Augusta, Atlanta, announcing that audiences could witness the remarkable colored girl who never forgets, and the Negro child prodigy with perfect memory. He rented halls and charged admission, pricing tickets high enough to generate significant income, but low enough to ensure good attendance. The demonstrations were advertised as both scientific exhibitions and entertainment, promising audiences they would witness abilities, defying medical explanation, and proving the wonders of the human mind. The demonstrations followed a consistent format Dr. Morrison refined over multiple performances. Sarah would be brought onto a stage where Dr. Morrison would introduce her and provide brief background about her abilities and the testing he had conducted. Then audience members would be invited to bring materials forward, books, newspapers, maps, documents, anything they wanted to test Sarah with. Dr. Morrison would show these materials to Sarah briefly, usually for just a few seconds, and then ask her to recall what she had seen. She would recite text word for word, describe images in detail, and reproduce maps and diagrams, demonstrating her perfect memory to the amazement of paying audiences. Dr. Morrison would lecture during these demonstrations about the scientific significance of Sarah's abilities, speculate about mechanisms that might account for her perfect memory, and sometimes argue that her case proved black people were capable of intellectual achievement despite racist theories. But regardless of how he framed these lectures or what arguments he made, the demonstrations were fundamentally exploitative. Sarah was being displayed as a curiosity, a spectacle, an oddity existing for white entertainment and amazement. She was being used to generate profit going primarily to Dr. Morrison rather than to Sarah or her mother. She was being subjected to pressure, stress, and exhaustion, performing repeatedly for audiences often hostile, dealing with the psychological burden of being treated as less than fully human, and experiencing the trauma of being stared at, evaluated, and discussed as if she were an object rather than a person. Harriet tried to protect her daughter and limit the exploitation, but she had minimal power in this situation. Dr. Morrison controlled access to Sarah during the demonstrations and kept most of the profits for himself, giving Harriet only small payments framed as compensation for Sarah's time, rather than as a fair share of the income her abilities generated. When Harriet complained or tried to refuse to allow Sarah to participate, Dr. Morrison would threaten to have Sarah taken away through legal mechanisms, remind Harriet that as a black woman, she had no legal standing to resist white authority, and make clear that continued resistance would result in consequences far worse than the exploitation Harriet was trying to prevent. The audiences at these demonstrations were mixed in their reactions, revealing the complex and contradictory attitudes white Southerners held toward black people and black abilities in the immediate aftermath of slavery. Some audience members were genuinely amazed by Sarah's abilities and forced to reconsider their assumptions about black intellectual inferiority. They would leave the demonstrations talking about what they had witnessed, questioning whether racist theories they had been taught could be correct if a black child could demonstrate abilities exceeding what educated white adults could achieve. For some whites, Sarah's perfect memory was genuinely eye-opening and genuinely challenged their beliefs about race and human potential. But other audience members were suspicious and hostile, assuming trickery or fraud must be involved because they couldn't accept a black child could possess abilities exceeding what most white people could achieve. They would scrutinize Sarah's performances for evidence of deception, bring deliberately difficult or obscure materials to try to catch her making errors, and accuse Dr. Morrison of coaching her or having Confederates in the audience providing information through hidden signals. Some would leave still convinced the whole thing was a fraud, their racist beliefs protected from challenge by their refusal to accept evidence contradicting those beliefs. Still other audience members were disturbed and threatened by Sarah's gifts, viewing them as unnatural, as evidence of demonic influence, or as something that shouldn't exist regardless of how real the abilities clearly were. They would frame Sarah's memory as unnatural, as something violating the proper order of creation, as evidence that something was wrong with her, rather than as an indication of exceptional ability. Some invoked religious explanations, suggesting Satan had given Sarah her abilities to deceive people or challenge divine order, refusing to celebrate abilities in a black child that they would have praised as God, given if demonstrated by a white child. The religious interpretation of Sarah's abilities became increasingly prominent and problematic as the demonstrations continued through summer and fall of 1866. White ministers began attending the demonstrations and using Sarah's case in their sermons, though they disagreed dramatically about what her abilities meant and how they should be interpreted. Some ministers preached that Sarah's perfect memory was a gift from God, proving black people were fully human and deserving of equal rights. That God had blessed this child as a sign black people should be treated with dignity and respect. These ministers used Sarah's case to argue for racial equality and black advancement, claiming her abilities were evidence of God's favor toward freed people and proof that claims about black intellectual inferiority were false and sinful. But other ministers preached that Sarah's abilities were unnatural and demonic, that no human should have such perfect recall of everything they encountered, that her memory was a sign of possession by evil spirits or Satan himself. They cited biblical passages about demons and possession, claimed Sarah's abilities allowed her to access forbidden knowledge, and argued that her perfect memory gave her powers humans weren't meant to have. These ministers used Sarah's case to argue that black people were inherently connected to evil forces, that freedom had unleashed demonic influences slavery had contained, and that Sarah represented the dangers of black autonomy and development. These theological debates became increasingly heated and public, with different denominations and ministers taking opposed positions about what Sarah represented and how her abilities should be understood. Sarah's case became a focal point for broader religious arguments about race, human nature, the relationship between the natural and supernatural, and what emancipation meant for the social and spiritual order of Southern society. And through all these debates, Sarah herself remained voiceless and powerless, a child whose extraordinary gifts had made her the subject of adult conflicts and ideological battles she couldn't control or escape. The turning point that would make Sarah's situation even more dangerous and ultimately lead to the suppression of her case came in the fall of 1866, when her demonstrations and her perfect memory began touching on subjects white society desperately wanted to forget and suppress. During one demonstration in late October, an audience member, perhaps intending to test Sarah or genuinely curious about the limits of her abilities, brought forward a page torn from a wartime newspaper. The page contained an article and an illustration about a lynching that had occurred in Wilkes County in 1863, during the war years when Confederate authorities and local white vigilantes had used terror and violence to suppress any hint of black resistance or sympathy for Union causes. Dr. Morrison, who hadn't screened the material before it was shown to Sarah, allowed the demonstration to proceed. Sarah looked at the newspaper page briefly for perhaps 5 or 10 seconds. Then, when asked to recall what she had seen, she recited the article word for word in her clear, precise voice that carried to every corner of the hall. The article described how a black man named Joshua had been accused of encouraging other enslaved people to flee to Union lines, how he had been captured by Confederate authorities, and how he had been hanged publicly as a warning to others. Sarah recited all these details exactly as they appeared in the article. Then she described the illustration that accompanied the article, a woodcut showing the lynching scene with multiple figures visible, including the victim and the white men who had carried out the killing. And then Sarah did something Dr. Morrison hadn't expected and couldn't stop. She began identifying the white men in the illustration, naming them by the names she recognized from her own memories and stories she had heard in the black community. "That's Mr. Patterson," she said, pointing to where the figure was in her mental image of the illustration. "He ran the general store. And that's Mr. Willis, who owned the plantation north of town. And that's Mr. Carver, who was the sheriff." She continued naming men, identifying them by their roles in the community, describing them from her perfect memory of having seen them around Washington and Wilkes County during her childhood. The audience reaction was immediate, visceral, and hostile. Men who had been at that lynching or knew the men Sarah was naming recognized themselves or their associates in her descriptions. They shouted denials, accused Dr. Morrison of coaching Sarah to make false accusations, accused Sarah herself of lying. Some stood and threatened violence, their faces red with rage. The demonstration ended in chaos, with Dr. Morrison rushing Sarah off the stage, while audience members shouted and argued, and some demanded their money back, claiming they had been brought to witness an educational exhibition, not to be accused of crimes by a black child who couldn't possibly remember events accurately. Dr. Morrison tried to smooth over the incident, claiming Sarah had simply been confused or had been identifying people randomly, without any real knowledge of who had been involved in the lynching. But the damage was done. Sarah had revealed what white men wanted forgotten and erased from public record. She had demonstrated that she remembered specific faces, specific names, and specific events from her childhood during slavery and the war years, and that she could testify with perfect accuracy about violence and crimes white society wanted buried in the service of reconciliation and moving forward without accountability for past atrocities. After this incident, something shifted in how white society viewed Sarah. She was no longer just an amusing curiosity or a scientific wonder. She was a threat. She was a witness who couldn't be made to forget, who could testify about things white men had assumed were safely hidden in the past. She was evidence that couldn't be destroyed and couldn't be suppressed through the normal mechanisms of intimidation and silencing white society used to control black testimony. And Sarah herself seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, what her perfect memory meant in this context. She began spontaneously producing drawings and descriptions during and after the demonstrations, not just reproducing whatever Dr. Morrison showed her, but drawing and describing scenes from her own memories, scenes from slavery and the violent early days after emancipation. She would draw faces of white men she had seen participating in whippings, sexual violence against enslaved women, and theft of property from freed black people. She would recall conversations she had overheard, threats that had been made, and names of people who had disappeared, whose disappearances had never been officially investigated or acknowledged. She drew maps showing locations of unmarked graves where bodies of black people had been buried in secret after being killed by white violence. She named specific plantations and specific white families where she had witnessed or heard about brutal treatment. She recalled details about fraud in labor contracts that were supposed to pay freed people for their work, but used various tricks to keep black workers in debt. She recalled specific incidents of violence used to suppress black political organizing and black attempts to claim rights emancipation was supposed to have granted. She became, through her perfect memory and willingness to testify to what she remembered, a living archive of white crimes against black people during slavery and the violent early years of Reconstruction. Every incident she had witnessed or heard about, every face she had seen, every name she had learned, all of it was stored permanently in her perfect memory and could be recalled and reported with accuracy that couldn't be challenged or discredited through the usual methods of attacking black testimony. This made Sarah extraordinarily dangerous to white power in Georgia in 1866-1867. Reconstruction was a time of intense political struggle over what the post-slavery South would become. The federal government and Republican Party were trying to reconstruct Southern society on a basis of black citizenship, political participation, and legal equality. But white Southerners were resisting with massive and organized violence, using terror to suppress black voting and political organizing, using economic coercion to force black people back into labor arrangements resembling slavery, and using legal mechanisms and extralegal violence to restore white supremacy and white control. Central to this white resistance was the need to forget the crimes of slavery and war, to move forward without accountability for what had been done to black people during centuries of enslavement and during the war that had tried to preserve it. White Southerners needed historical amnesia. They needed to rewrite the past as having been less brutal than it was. They needed to suppress testimony and evidence documenting what had really happened and who had been responsible. The lost cause mythology that would dominate Southern and American historical memory for a century was already being constructed. myths about benevolent slavery, about honorable Confederate soldiers fighting for states' rights rather than for slavery, about Reconstruction as corrupt Northern tyranny rather than as an attempt to build genuine democracy. Sarah's perfect memory threatened all of this. She was a witness who couldn't be made to forget, who could testify with perfect accuracy about violence and exploitation white men wanted buried. She was evidence that couldn't be destroyed and couldn't be suppressed through intimidation, because her memory was permanent and she had already demonstrated publicly that she could recall things powerful people wanted forgotten. Her very existence challenged the historical forgetting white supremacy required. Local newspapers that had initially reported on Sarah's demonstrations with fascination and curiosity now stopped mentioning her name. Articles planned about the memory girl were killed by editors who recognized that continued publicity about Sarah and her abilities would create problems for the white power structure. Dr. Morrison, who had been organizing and profiting from Sarah's public appearances, suddenly found himself under intense pressure from local white authorities to stop the demonstrations immediately and cease drawing attention to the brown girl's memories. He received threats, veiled at first, then increasingly explicit, making clear that continuing to display Sarah and allow her to testify about what she remembered would result in violence against him. Sarah and Harriet, white men who had attended the demonstrations and been disturbed by Sarah naming names and recalling violence, visited Dr. Morrison privately and told him in unmistakable terms that the demonstrations must stop, that Sarah must be silenced, and that if he continued to profit from exploiting her memory, he would face consequences, making him regret ever coming to Georgia. By early 1867, Dr. Morrison had capitulated completely to this pressure. He stopped organizing demonstrations, stopped testing Sarah, and stopped talking about her case publicly. By March 1867, he had left Georgia entirely, returning to Pennsylvania and abandoning his work with the Freedmen's Bureau. He took with him all his notes and documentation about Sarah's case, all the detailed records of his testing, measurements, observations, and examples of Sarah's perfect recall he had so meticulously documented. He never published his findings in medical journals, as he had initially intended, and as he had promised Harriet he would do. The detailed reports he had written describing Sarah's abilities, which he had told Harriet would help prove black intellectual capacity and advance racial equality, were stored away in his private papers and never submitted for peer review or scholarly discussion. The case that had seemed poised to revolutionize understanding of human memory and offer powerful evidence against scientific racism simply disappeared from scientific discourse, suppressed not through academic critique or questions about research methodology, but through political and social pressure from whites who couldn't tolerate the implications of Sarah's perfect recall and testimony. Sarah and Harriet were left in Georgia, more vulnerable than before because they were now known to white authorities as sources of dangerous memory and dangerous testimony. The protection Dr. Morrison's presence and federal authority had provided, minimal as it had been, was gone. They were exposed to retaliation and violence with no one to protect them or intervene on their behalf. The black community did what it could to protect them, but resources were limited and dangers real and pervasive. They moved from Washington to Augusta in summer 1867, hoping a larger city might offer more anonymity and safety. Augusta had a substantial black population, some federal troop presence that might offer protection, and more opportunities for employment and education. Harriet found work as a laundress, the same backbreaking labor she had been doing in Washington. Sarah continued to attend school when possible, though her formal education was constantly interrupted by the need to work to help support them, and by the general chaos and danger of Reconstruction-era Georgia, where violence against black people was constant and black institutions like schools and churches were frequent targets of white terrorism. In Augusta, Sarah came to the attention of a black church community, and specifically a minister named Reverend Thomas Wilson, who ran a school for freed children in connection with his African Methodist Episcopal Church. Reverend Wilson had heard stories about Sarah's remarkable memory, stories that had spread through white communities to suppress knowledge of Sarah's case, and he was committed protecting her, helping her develop audiences and ways that to danger from whites who feared what she could remember whites and what she could remember whites who fear whites. Under Reverend Wilson's protection and guidance from 1867 onward, Sarah's education continued and deepened, and her abilities were directed toward purposes the black community chose rather than purposes white exploitation imposed. She became a living repository of community history and collective memory. Families separated during slavery would bring her photographs of loved ones they had been separated from, tell her stories about parents, children, or siblings sold away, and share what information they had about where those people might have been taken. Sarah would memorize all of it. The faces in photographs, names and relationships, fragments of information about locations, sales, and last known whereabouts. She became a human archive, storing information about black families and black history that no other permanent record and would have been lost forever if it had depended solely on written documentation most black people had no ability or resources to create. Elderly formerly enslaved people would seek out Sarah to tell her their stories, wanting someone to remember what they had lived through, wanting their experiences preserved somewhere, even if white society refused to acknowledge or document the realities of slavery and its aftermath. Sarah would listen with perfect attention and remember everything. Names, dates, places, specific details about work, family, resistance, survival, and loss. She could recall these stories years later with perfect accuracy, answer questions about people and events with no other documentation, and serve as a living connection to a past rapidly being forgotten or deliberately erased by forces of white historical revisionism already beginning to construct the lost cause mythology and rewrite slavery as benevolent and Reconstruction as tragedy. For several years, from 1867 to around 1870, Sarah lived in Augusta and functioned as a community historian and keeper of collective memory, protected by Reverend Wilson's church and community members who recognized the value and importance of her gifts when used to serve black memory and black history, rather than white curiosity or white profit. She attended school when possible and demonstrated extraordinary academic abilities, far beyond her perfect memory. She learned to read and write with remarkable speed, progressing from basic literacy to sophisticated reading comprehension in months rather than years. She mastered mathematics, geography, and history far beyond what would normally be expected for a child her age. Teachers reported that Sarah could read a textbook once and then answer any question about its contents from memory, that she never needed to review or study material because she retained everything perfectly after a single exposure. She could look at a map in a geography book for a few seconds and then draw it from memory or answer questions about locations of cities, rivers, mountain ranges, and national borders. She could read a history book once and recite dates, events, and names with perfect accuracy, recall exact quotations from historical figures, describe illustrations, and even reproduced them by drawing. By age 12 in 1870, Sarah had completed what would normally be considered a primary education and had begun studying more advanced subjects: algebra and geometry, Latin grammar, works of literature and history, typically taught only to much older students in elite schools, educating white children for university. Her teachers were amazed by her abilities and convinced she could excel at the highest levels of education if she could access opportunities almost entirely closed to black students, especially black female students in the South. But even within the relative safety of Reverend Wilson's church and the black community in Augusta, Sarah could not be entirely protected from white attention and white threats. Stories about her perfect memory continued circulating through networks of communication that existed despite white efforts to control information. Some whites were simply curious and wanted to witness Sarah's abilities for themselves, but others viewed her as a continuing threat, someone whose memory preserved testimony about crimes that needed to remain hidden, someone whose abilities challenged white supremacist ideology in ways that couldn't be tolerated. In 1870, when Sarah was 12 years old, there was a serious attempt by white authorities to have her forcibly taken for medical examination by white doctors who wanted to study her brain and spoke openly about their desire to perform an autopsy after her death to determine if there were physical differences in her brain structure that might account for her abilities. This wasn't pure scientific curiosity. It was part of broader efforts by white scientists and physicians to find biological justification for racial hierarchy, to identify physical differences between black and white brains that could justify claims about black intellectual inferiority. The fact that Sarah demonstrated abilities exceeding what most white people could achieve was threatening to these theories and needed to be explained in ways that didn't challenge racial hierarchy. Some white physicians theorized that Sarah's perfect memory might be associated with brain abnormalities or defects that made her exceptional, but also less than fully human in other ways. They wanted to examine her, measure her, and document her in ways that would allow them to explain her abilities without acknowledging that a black child possessed genuine genius that couldn't be explained away through racist frameworks. The black community successfully resisted this attempt through collective action and armed defense. When white authorities came to Reverend Wilson's church looking for Sarah, they found the building surrounded by black men who made clear they would use force to prevent Sarah from being taken. Reverend Wilson negotiated with the authorities, invoking federal law and Freedmen's Bureau authority, making legal arguments about Sarah's rights and the illegality of forcibly taking her for medical examination without her consent or her mother's consent. The authorities eventually backed down, but the threat remained clear. Sarah was not safe and would never be truly safe as long as she remained in the South, where her perfect memory was viewed as dangerous and black people had insufficient power to protect their own from white violence and exploitation. The decision was made by Harriet, Reverend Wilson, and other black community leaders that Sarah needed to leave the South entirely. In 1871, arrangements were made to send Sarah north to Philadelphia, where she could live with a family connected to the African Methodist Episcopal Church and attend the Institute for Colored Youth, a prestigious black educational institution providing classical education to black students with a reputation for academic excellence and preparing students for professional careers and leadership roles in the black community. Harriet remained in Augusta. She couldn't afford to travel north, couldn't find employment there that would allow her to support herself, and had her entire life and limited social networks in Georgia, despite all the dangers and difficulties. The separation from her daughter was agonizing for both. Harriet was sending away the child she had worked so hard to protect and educate. Would not see her grow up, would not be present for all the milestones and achievements she had hoped her daughter would experience. But she also understood that staying in the South would likely mean Sarah's abilities would be suppressed, that Sarah would face continuing danger and exploitation, and that the extraordinary gifts Sarah possessed would never be fully developed or used in ways that honored their significance. Sarah and Harriet maintained contact through letters after Sarah moved to Philadelphia. Harriet, who had learned basic literacy in the years since emancipation, would write to her daughter in careful, labored handwriting, and Sarah would respond with letters demonstrating her increasingly sophisticated education and continuing love for her mother. But they would never see each other again in person. Harriet died in 1879 from lung disease resulting from years of breathing smoke and chemicals from laundry work. Sarah received news of her mother's death weeks after it occurred, too late to return for the funeral, even if she had been able to afford the journey. The grief of losing her mother while separated by hundreds of miles, of never having the chance to say goodbye, of knowing Harriet died without seeing her daughter one final time. This grief Sarah carried for the rest of her life, preserved with perfect clarity in her perfect memory, just like everything else she experienced. In Philadelphia, Sarah attended the Institute for Colored Youth from 1871 to 1876, receiving an education excellent by any standard and extraordinary by what was available to black students anywhere in America. The Institute's faculty were highly educated black teachers and white Quaker supporters, committed to providing rigorous classical education to black students, teaching Latin, Greek, advanced mathematics, sciences, literature, and history, preparing students to become teachers, ministers, and professionals who could serve and lead the black community. Teachers at the Institute were amazed by Sarah's abilities from her first days at the school. She consistently scored perfectly on examinations, never missing a question or making an error. She could recite entire books from memory after reading them once. She could master complex subjects, higher mathematics, Latin grammar, scientific principles, after single exposures to material other students needed weeks or months of study to learn. She excelled particularly in languages, learning Latin, French, and beginning Greek with a speed and facility suggesting she would be able to master any language she chose to study. But Sarah's time in Philadelphia also revealed the limitations and burdens of her perfect memory in ways that became increasingly clear as she grew older and accumulated more experiences and more memories. She could not forget anything, not just the academic material she studied for school, but also every painful experience, every trauma, every violence she had witnessed or experienced during slavery and Reconstruction. Her memory preserved everything with perfect fidelity and permanence. The brutalities of slavery that most people would gradually forget or process in ways making them less overwhelming remained perfectly vivid in Sarah's recall. She could remember specific instances of violence against her mother, specific threats from white men, and specific scenes of suffering she had witnessed as a young child. These memories didn't fade or become less painful over time. They remained as clear and distressing as if they were happening in the present. Faculty and students at the Institute reported that Sarah would sometimes become overwhelmed by her memories, experiencing past traumas as if they were happening in the present moment, struggling to distinguish between memory and current reality when her recall was so vivid and complete that remembering felt subjectively identical to experiencing. She would sometimes freeze in the middle of activities, her expression vacant, clearly seeing something no one else could see. And when she returned to awareness of her surroundings, she would be shaking and distressed, having just relived some terrible memory with perfect clarity. Modern psychology would recognize these symptoms as consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, though that diagnostic category didn't exist in the 1870s, and Sarah received no treatment or therapeutic support for the psychological burden her perfect memory created. Faculty tried to be supportive and understanding, but they had no framework for addressing the unique suffering that came from being unable to forget trauma. From having every painful memory preserved with permanent clarity, from lacking the natural forgetting and gradual fading of traumatic memory that allows most people to process and recover from terrible experiences over time. Sarah graduated from the Institute for Colored Youth in 1876 at age 18, having completed an education impressive for any student and extraordinary given her circumstances and limited educational opportunities for Black students even in the North. She was qualified to teach, to continue in higher education if such opportunities existed for Black women's, which they largely didn't in 1876, and to contribute to Black intellectual and cultural life in ways that would have honored her abilities and used her gifts for purposes she chose. But there are essentially no records of what happened to Sarah Brown after her graduation from the Institute in 1876. She disappears from the historical record almost completely. No marriage record, no death certificate, no employment records, no further correspondence or documentation of any kind discovered despite extensive searches by historians interested in her case. It's as if she vanished, as if her existence simply ended when she was 18, as if the person who possessed perfect memory and extraordinary intellectual abilities left no trace of her own continued life after that point. This disappearance from historical record is itself deeply mysterious and troubling. Several possibilities exist, none definitively provable with available evidence. Sarah might have died young, perhaps from illness or suicide, if the burden of her perfect memory and inability to forget trauma became unbearable. Black women in the 1870s had high mortality rates, and their deaths often went unrecorded, or recorded in ways that didn't connect to their earlier lives, making it possible Sarah died without leaving documentary evidence historians could later find and connect to her. Alternatively, Sarah might have deliberately erased her own presence from historical record, adopting a new name and identity to escape the attention and dangers her abilities had attracted throughout her life. This wouldn't have been unusual. Many Black people changed their names after emancipation, either to mark the transition to freedom, escape past associations, or protect themselves from ongoing dangers. If Sarah had chosen to live under a different name and not display her perfect memory abilities publicly, she could have lived a long life leaving no documentary trace connecting her to the Sarah Brown who attended the Institute for Colored Youth. She might have married and taken her husband's name, moved to a different city or state, where she wasn't known, or deliberately chosen obscurity and privacy over public recognition. Given how much suffering her perfect memory had caused, the exploitation by Dr. Morrison, threats from whites who feared her testimony, constant pressure of being treated as spectacle rather than person, and burden of being unable to forget trauma. It would be entirely understandable if Sarah had chosen to hide her abilities and live as anonymously as possible. Or something might have happened to her. Violence, exploitation, institutional confinement. If her episodes of being overwhelmed by traumatic memory were misunderstood as insanity, That could have removed her from circumstances where she would leave documentary evidence. The 1870s and 1880s were periods of intense racial violence and oppression in both North and South. Black people who stood out in any way, who challenged racial hierarchies through their abilities or achievements, who possessed knowledge or capabilities, threatening white supremacy, were targets for violence and suppression. Sarah's perfect memory had already made her a target multiple times. It's possible she met a fate never properly recorded or deliberately hidden. We will probably never know with certainty what happened to Sarah Brown after 1876. What we do know is that her case was never properly documented or studied by the white scientific and medical establishment, that her extraordinary abilities were exploited rather than honored during her childhood, that she was endangered rather than protected, and that ultimately she was forgotten by the dominant society that had briefly found her useful and then found her too dangerous to remember. The fragmentary evidence of Sarah's life and abilities preserved comes from several sources maintained by the Black community and rediscovered by historians beginning in the 1980s. When scholars became interested in uncovering suppressed stories from Reconstruction-era Black history, a photograph exists taken in 1866 showing a small black girl in a plain dress standing in front of a wooden church. This is believed to be Sarah, though the photograph carries no identifying information beyond a handwritten note on the back saying, "Memory Girl, Washington, Georgia, 1866. The photograph shows a child with an intense, serious expression, standing very still and straight, looking directly at the camera with eyes seeming older than her years. Letters preserved in the archives of the African Methodist Episcopal Church include references to the brown girl from Georgia who remembers everything, and discussions among church leaders about protecting her and ensuring her education. A letter from Reverend Wilson to church officials in Philadelphia includes this passage: "We are sending you a child of exceptional gifts who requires protection and education beyond what we can provide here. She possesses perfect memory and has suffered greatly from those who would exploit such ability. She carries also the wounds of slavery and violence witnessed and will require patience and understanding as she develops her remarkable capabilities." Most significantly, a journal kept by Reverend Thomas Wilson, discovered in a church archive in Augusta in the 1980s, contains extensive descriptions of Sarah's abilities and discussions of how the Black community worked to protect her and use her memory to preserve family histories and community knowledge. The journal includes this striking passage written in 1869. "The child Sarah remembers everything, every face, every name, every story told to her. She has become our living archive, preserving the memories of our people that no written record captures. But she carries also a terrible burden, for she cannot forget the horrors she has witnessed. She remembers slavery with perfect clarity, remembers violence and suffering that most have the mercy of forgetting gradually. I pray that her gift, which is also her curse, might serve some larger purpose that makes her suffering meaningful." And there is the letter from Martha Williams, Sarah's first teacher, written to a colleague in Philadelphia in 1867. This letter, discovered in the papers of a Quaker missionary family, discusses Sarah's case with striking insight. They fear what she remembers. It is not the child they flee from. It is the history she carries in her head. She is living testimony to crimes they wish to forget, to violence they wish to deny, to humanity and Black people they wish to suppress. In a nation desperate to forget its sins and move forward without accountability, a girl who cannot forget becomes the greatest threat of all. She preserves truth that power wishes buried, and truth is always dangerous to those whose authority depends upon lies and historical erasure. Modern historians and psychologists studying the fragmentary evidence of Sarah Brown's case recognize that she possessed real and identical or photographic memory and kind of extremely rare and poorly understood in contemporary neuroscience and psychology. True eidetic memory, the ability to recall sensory information with perfect fidelity as if viewing an internal image or recording, is distinguished from simply excellent memory or trained memory techniques by the accuracy, permanence, and automatic nature of recall. Sarah's abilities, as documented in contemporary sources, seem to represent authentic eidetic memory rather than simply exceptional memory skills. The descriptions of her being able to recite entire pages of text after viewing them for seconds, reproduce complex images with perfect fidelity, and recall information perfectly after single exposures without any effort at memorization, all point toward genuine photographic memory rather than toward learned techniques or exceptional, but still fundamentally normal memory abilities. The case also reveals the particular dangers and burdens facing exceptionally gifted Black individuals in Reconstruction-era America and the decades that followed. Sarah's abilities should have been celebrated, should have opened doors to education and opportunity, should have made her life richer and more successful. Instead, her gifts made her a target for exploitation by whites who saw her as source of profit or scientific curiosity. Her perfect memory made her dangerous to whites who needed to suppress Black testimony about slavery and Reconstruction violence. Her abilities challenged racist ideology in ways threatening white supremacy and making her existence intolerable to white power structures. The suppression of her case, the way Dr. Morrison's documentation was never published, the way newspaper coverage stopped when her memories began touching on white crimes, the way she disappeared from historical record after leaving the South. All of this reveals how threats to racial hierarchy were systematically suppressed regardless of their scientific or historical significance. Sarah Brown's story also highlights the political nature of memory and historical preservation. Who gets to remember? Whose memories are preserved and whose erased? What happens when a society's need to forget, its need to rewrite history in ways serving current power relations, comes into conflict with individuals whose memories will not cooperate with collective amnesia? Sarah's perfect memory made her a threat precisely because she could not be made to forget, could not be convinced events had happened differently than she remembered, could not be silenced through normal mechanisms of historical revision and erasure, allowing white society to construct the lost cosmology and suppress testimony about realities of slavery and Reconstruction violence. In the end, Sarah Brown was defeated not by limitations of her own abilities, but by a society that could not tolerate her gifts. She deserved celebration, protection, and opportunity to develop her extraordinary memory in ways serving purposes she chose. Instead, she faced exploitation, danger, and ultimately erasure. Her story stands as one of countless examples of how Black genius and Black testimony have been systematically suppressed throughout American history when they threatened white power and white historical narratives. What do you think of Sarah Brown's story? Do you believe she truly possessed photographic memory, as evidence suggests? Why do you think her case was suppressed, and why did she disappear from historical record? Have you heard stories in your family about individuals with extraordinary abilities who were exploited rather than celebrated? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story important and moving, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with others who need to understand that Black history contains countless stories of extraordinary people whose gifts were suppressed, whose testimonies were silenced, and whose very existence was erased when their abilities or memories threatened white power. Remember that Sarah Brown's perfect memory should have been a blessing but became a burden because she lived in a society that could not tolerate the truth. She remembered and would rather destroy genius than act. Knowledge it existed and challenged every racist assumption about Black inferiority. Honor her memory by refusing to forget her story and committing to preserving and sharing it.